She stood in the shadows of cathedrals and castles, unnoticed by chroniclers, yet central to life and death. A woman who whispered through the pain of childbirth, walked among plague and blood, and held the secrets of generations in her calloused hands. She was a medieval midwife, healer, outcast, witch, or savior, depending on who you asked. Her world was one of bodily fluids and spiritual dread, where a single mistake could cost a life or her own. What did it truly mean to guide birth? In a time when medicine and myth blurred into one, in the medieval world, childbirth was not a moment of joy, it was a confrontation with death. In towns blanketed by filth, disease, and fear, giving birth was among the riskiest acts a woman could face. Europe between the 12th and 15th centuries was a place where mortality shaped everything, from how people lived to how they worshipped. Half of all children died before the age of 5, and maternal death was so common that women preparing to give birth often confessed their sins and received last rites before labor began. Medicine, as we understand it today, didn't exist. There were no hospitals with trained obstetricians. There were no antiseptics, no anesthesia, no understanding of germs. What passed for medical knowledge came from ancient texts, Galen, Hippocrates, and later Avicenna, filtered through church doctrine and medieval superstition. Most physicians were men trained in universities, but their involvement in childbirth was minimal. The birthing room was considered a female domain, a space closed off from formal medicine and male intervention. Cities like London, Paris, or Florence were overcrowded and unsanitary. Waste was thrown into the streets, animals roamed freely, and clean water was rare. Disease was a constant threat. The Black Death alone wiped out between 30% to 60% of Europe's population in the mid-14th century. In this landscape, infections after childbirth were common and often fatal. Puerperal fever, an infection caused by bacteria entering the womb, was poorly understood, but killed thousands. The only ones regularly attending these births were midwives. Midwives were not formally educated, but they held knowledge passed down through generations, practical experience, herbal remedies, ritual practices. They understood the rhythms of labor, the signs of trouble, and how to respond. They were often the first and last voice a woman heard during childbirth. The church played a powerful role in every aspect of life, including birth. Childbirth was tied to religious belief. It was considered a punishment for Eve's original sin, as stated in Genesis. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children. A woman's suffering during labor was expected, even sanctified, but childbirth also involved spiritual risk. If a baby died unbaptized, it was believed to be denied heaven. Midwives were sometimes authorized to baptize newborns themselves. If death seemed imminent, this made them not just caregivers, but spiritual agents, a responsibility that gave them both significance and suspicion in a deeply religious world. Socially, women occupied a subordinate position. They were legally and economically dependent on men and largely excluded from formal education. Yet in childbirth, women reclaimed a kind of authority. The birthing chamber became one of the few places where women were in control. Midwives, mothers, and female neighbors gathering in a space hidden from male eyes. In that room, the knowledge and instincts of women mattered more than any learned texts. But power in such a space was fragile. If something went wrong, blame could fall quickly. A stillbirth, a maternal death, or an unusual practice might lead to accusations, sometimes of incompetence, sometimes of witchcraft. Midwives walked a narrow line between necessity and threat. In a world governed by blood, bones, and belief, midwives were both needed and feared. They stepped into a role no one else would, in rooms where death lingered and pain was unavoidable. Their work was often unrecognized, their names forgotten, but without them, childbirth would have been even more perilous. They were the quiet edge between life and the grave. In medieval Europe, there were no formal schools for midwifery, no textbooks, no certificates. A midwife learned by doing, watching others, assisting, failing, trying again. Most were older women who had raised children of their own. Many were widows, women who had outlived husbands and now lived with a rare independence. Some were daughters or nieces of midwives, inheriting knowledge passed down like a family craft. There were no standardized tools or uniform practices. Each midwife carried a personal blend of experience, ritual, and instinct in towns and villages. Their presence was constant. They weren't called in just at the final moments of birth. They were there through the labor, the blood, the screams, the aftermath. They acted as coach, surgeon, comforter, and cleaner, all in one. In larger towns, some gained reputations that crossed parish lines, becoming trusted names even without formal credentials. Yet in every case, their authority came not from institutions, but from the survival of mothers and children, one successful birth at a time. Their knowledge was tactile, physical, and grounded in routine. They learned to spot breech positions by hand. They knew which herbs eased pain or stopped bleeding, like mugwort, pennyroyal, or betony, and which ones could kill. They monitored pulses, urine color, and the texture of the afterbirth for signs of trouble. Most couldn't read, but they didn't need books to know the body. They carried in their memories the stories of dozens, sometimes hundreds, of births. Their authority was both respected and precarious. In some regions, midwives were licensed by bishops or local councils. The 13th century church began to take greater interest in their work, partly to ensure the spiritual safety of infants. A midwife who failed to baptize a dying newborn could be accused of spiritual negligence. In France, by the late Middle Ages, some towns required midwives to swear oaths of honesty, secrecy, and obedience to church teachings, but no official approval could shield them completely. Their knowledge, especially about reproduction, herbs, and female anatomy, made them suspect. They were women who operated outside male control. In rural communities, where superstition ran strong, a midwife's role in both birth and death gave her an eerie reputation. If a child was stillborn, or a mother died during labor, whispers followed. Sometimes they were accused of using charms or spells. Sometimes they were blamed outright for murder. Their position mirrored the contradictions of medieval life. They were vital, yet excluded from most records, needed, yet easily scapegoated. In many ways, they were the first and only line of maternal care in an age when childbirth was lethal. They operated in kitchens, bedrooms, beds, anywhere a woman went into labor, and while their names are rarely recorded in history books, their hands shaped every generation that followed in the medieval birthing chamber. A midwife's tools were simple, often homemade, and deeply rooted in both tradition and trial. There were no surgical instruments, no sterile gloves, no measured doses, yet births still happened daily, in homes, cottages, and village rooms warmed by firelight and crowded with female relatives. A midwife worked in this space with what she could carry, what she could remember, and what she believed would work. One of the oldest and most reliable tools was the birthing stool. Its design was practical, a low wooden seat with a large hole in the middle, allowing gravity to assist in labor. These stools were often passed down through generations or fashioned by local craftsmen. Some were little more than modified chairs, while others were carefully carved with symbols believed to ward off evil or misfortune. Swaddling cloths were always close at hand. Midwives used strips of linen or wool to wrap newborns tightly after delivery, both for warmth and to keep limbs straight, a practice supported by the belief that it would help form strong, proper bones. The cloths were washed and reused, often shared within communities, and occasionally embroidered with small protective crosses. Herbal knowledge was essential. Midwives collected, dried, and mixed herbs for every stage of labor and recovery. Pennyroyal and tansy were used cautiously to stimulate uterine contractions, though both were dangerous in the wrong amounts. Mugwort, long associated with women's health, was used to ease menstrual discomfort and promote labor. For pain, they might offer poppy-infused mixtures or chewable bark with mild sedative effects, crude, inconsistent, but sometimes effective. After birth, complications were common. If the placenta didn't pass or bleeding became severe, midwives had few options. Some used cobwebs pressed into the perineum to slow bleeding, not for cleanliness, but for their supposed clotting properties. Others packed wounds with wool, soaked in vinegar or wine, attempting to cleanse the area with whatever mild antiseptic action they believed those liquids offered. The line between medicine and superstition was thin. Amulets, relics, and holy objects were part of the birth process. Women sometimes clutched religious medals or saintly relics, especially those linked to Saint Margaret of Antioch, the patron of childbirth. Prayers were whispered as labor progressed. Latin phrases were etched into wax or parchment and hung around the laboring woman's neck or bed. These charms weren't seen as separate from medicine, they were part of it. Medical theory, when it did reach midwives, was filtered through texts like Trotula, a compilation of women's medicine that circulated widely in Latin Europe by the 12th century. Though midwives rarely read the original manuscripts, clerics or educated family members sometimes passed on bits of this knowledge. Concepts like balancing the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow, bile, black bile, found their way into birth advice. A woman with excess heat, for example, might be treated with cooling herbs. Midwives worked in a world where every tool carried both practical use and symbolic weight. The same stool that helped a woman give birth might later be blamed if something went wrong. The same herb that soothed pain might be labeled a witch's poison. Nothing was guaranteed, and every decision carried risk. Still, these women continued, using what little they had to confront one of the most dangerous moments in any woman's life. When labor began in medieval Europe, it wasn't a private ordeal, it was a community event, but one confined strictly to women. The birthing chamber was cleared of men. The room was darkened, windows covered, candles lit. Darkness was believed to calm the womb and ward off evil spirits. In many households, women closed the shutters with purpose. Light could invite malevolent forces or disrupt the balance of energies in a vulnerable body. Present in the room were the midwife, female relatives, and trusted neighbors. These women formed what was known as the gossip circle, not in the modern sense, but from the Old English godsib, meaning a sponsor or godparent. They were responsible for supporting the laboring woman, physically and spiritually. Some held her up, others prepared cloths, heated water, or boiled herbs. There was laughter, chants, prayers, and at times, silence thick with tension. The birthing stool was brought out if the woman didn't labor on a bed or pallet. Positioned over it, she was helped by attendants on either side, while the midwife crouched below, ready with cloths and warm liquids. Linen sheets were placed beneath her. A wooden bowl might be placed nearby to catch the afterbirth. Herbs were burned, rubbed on the skin, or brewed into strong infusions to be sipped between contractions. Religion was everywhere in the room. A crucifix might hang above the bed. An image of the Virgin Mary, especially in her role as protector of mothers, would be placed nearby. Saint Margaret of Antioch was invoked frequently. She was believed to have burst unharmed from the belly of a dragon and was widely venerated by women in labor. In the book of Margery Kempe, written in the early 15th century, the author, a lay mystic, recounts how she survived dangerous labor after calling out to Saint Margaret, promising a pilgrimage in return. Midwives often carried relics or blessed items. Some had parchment amulets bearing Latin inscriptions tied around the laboring woman's neck or thigh. One popular charm, recorded in medical manuscripts, bore the words Jesus Nazarenus Rex Ju. The inscription from the crucifix, believed to ease pain and protect the child. The line between medicine and magic was faint. Fear shaped everything. Most women knew someone who had died in childbirth. Stillbirths, breech, deliveries, and postpartum hemorrhage were common. In towns like York or Rouen, death records regularly list women dying in childbed. If a newborn showed signs of distress, the midwife had the authority to perform emergency baptism, often using water from a nearby jug, murmuring the words quietly, just in case the infant lived or died, before the priest arrived. The church accepted this practice and even instructed midwives in the formula. Yet the mood wasn't always grim. In some records, we find descriptions of songs sung to calm the mother, of warm drinks passed around to ease nerves. If the child was born healthy and the mother survived, the women would celebrate together before inviting the priest or the father back into the room. The birthing chamber was a space of risk and ritual, control and uncertainty. Life entered the world here, fragile, bloodied, and surrounded by prayer. In medieval Europe, childbirth was a gamble, and the odds were rarely in a woman's favor. Medical understanding was primitive, and the risks were many, obstructed. Labor, postpartum hemorrhage, retained placenta, puerperal fever. Each complication carried a high chance of death. It's estimated that between 1 in 10 and 1 in 20 women died due to complications during or shortly after childbirth. For many, it wasn't a question of if something would go wrong, but when. Obstructed labor, known today as cephalopelvic disproportion, was among the most feared. Without cesarean procedures, as we know them today, a child too large or improperly positioned often meant a prolonged, agonizing death for both mother and baby. Midwives had few options. In some regions, metal hooks or crude forceps were developed, but these were rare, dangerous, and typically not used outside monastic infirmaries or elite circles. For most midwives, intervention meant repositioning the baby manually, using their hands and instinct alone. Postpartum hemorrhage was another silent killer. If the uterus failed to contract, bleeding could continue unchecked. There were no transfusions, no surgical repairs. Midwives turned to pressure, binding, and herbal remedies. Shepherd's purse, nettle, and mugwort were believed to slow the flow of blood. In wealthier towns, linen cloths soaked in wine or vinegar were used, though success was inconsistent. infection followed closely behind. Known later as puerperal fever, this bacterial condition was invisible to medieval understanding. There was no knowledge of sterilization. Cloths were reused, water often contaminated, hands unwashed. If a mother developed a fever days after giving birth, her fate was almost always sealed. Death could come swiftly, accompanied by intense pain, swelling, and delirium. Letters from the 14th and 15th centuries record noble women who died not during labor, but days later, their deaths quietly noted in household accounts or monastic chronicles. Stillbirths were common and carried not only emotional weight, but spiritual urgency. The theology of the time held that a soul could not enter heaven unless baptized. An unbaptized infant was believed to be excluded from salvation, condemned not to hell, but to limbus infantium, a space outside heaven. This belief drove urgency into midwives' actions. If a baby emerged appearing lifeless, midwives would sprinkle water and perform conditional baptism. C2Es, homo ego, te baptisa. If you are a human, I baptize you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. The ritual had to be spoken aloud, with water touching the skin. Even the possibility of reviving a soul for heaven was considered worth the effort. Maternal death brought its own rites. If the woman had not confessed her sins or received the Eucharist before labor, her soul's fate was uncertain. Families often summoned a priest at the first signs of complications. In some places, midwives were instructed to encourage confession or administer last rites. If no clergy could arrive in time, a point of contention between church authorities and midwifery traditions. Every failed birth had consequences, for families, for communities, and often for the midwife. Blame followed death like a shadow. Whispers of negligence or unnatural knowledge could ruin reputations. In some rare cases, they led to formal accusations. Life and death in the birthing chamber were not only physical matters, they were theological, social, and often irreversible. The relationship between midwives and the medieval church was built on tension, a mix of dependence, regulation, and distrust. Midwives served a critical role in communities where childbirth was one of the most common and dangerous experiences in a woman's life. Yet their authority over birth, death, and even baptism placed them uncomfortably close to domains the church sought to control by the 13th century. Church officials began formalizing expectations for midwives. In 1231, Pope Gregory IX issued mandates requiring local bishops to oversee matters of spiritual importance in medical practices. By the 14th and 15th centuries, some midwives in parts of France, Italy, and the Low Countries were required to swear oaths to their bishop. These oaths often pledged that they would not perform magic, would not suggest contraceptives or abortive remedies, and would baptize infants properly if necessary. In Paris, records from 1460 show that midwives had to be examined by a panel of doctors and clergy before receiving a license to practice. Yet licensing was inconsistent. In many rural areas, midwifery remained unregulated and passed down informally. Midwives often knew more about childbirth than local priests or physicians, and this imbalance caused friction. Churchmen, especially in the later Middle Ages, viewed the midwife's spiritual authority with suspicion, particularly when she administered emergency baptisms or made decisions about spiritual matters in the absence of clergy. The baptismal issue was central. Church law allowed midwives to baptize a child if death was imminent, and no priest could be found in time. But this power, meant to save souls, also became a source of anxiety. Did the midwife know the correct words? Did she use real water? Did she perform the rite with proper intention? These questions had serious theological weight. In one 15th-century German case, a midwife was investigated for saying the words improperly and was banned from practice. Some midwives were even suspected of intentionally preventing baptisms. In Strasbourg in 1452, a midwife was accused of letting infants die unbaptized, a charge tied to fears of heretical sects that denied the need for the sacrament. There was no evidence that these suspicions were widespread or accurate, but in an era shaped by inquisitions and growing concern about unorthodox practices, such fears could easily spiral. At the same time, midwives were often the only line of defense. In a crisis, church authorities recognized their importance, especially in rural areas with limited clergy access. In dioceses like Milan or York, bishops sometimes appointed matron midwives to oversee others and report any questionable behavior. Manuals such as Trotula and later Eucherius Raslin's Rosengarten published in 1513 blended medical and moral instruction, reinforcing church-approved methods. But the real shift came in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, as fears of witchcraft intensified. The 1487 publication of Malleus Maleficarum by Heinrich Kramer marked a turning point. This text accused midwives directly of harming infants, interfering with baptisms, and invoking demonic forces during childbirth. It portrayed them not as healers, but as threats to Christian order. While not all church officials embraced these views, the association between midwifery and heresy grew more dangerous still. Most midwives continued their work, quietly balancing church expectations with the practical demands of childbirth. They baptized when necessary, avoided practices seen as suspect, and relied on community trust. Some even became minor religious figures in their own right, known for their piety as much as their skill. The church never fully embraced midwives, but it never removed them either. Their existence was tolerated, monitored, sometimes feared, but always necessary. In the eyes of many clergy, midwives were a risk. But for mothers and families, they were the only hope in a moment when hope was desperately needed. By the late Middle Ages, a shift was underway across Europe. What had once been tolerated as folk knowledge, the use of herbs, prayers, and practical techniques in childbirth, began to be reclassified as heresy, sorcery, or worse. Midwives, once respected in their communities, now stood on unstable ground. As anxieties about female autonomy, religious dissent, and unexplained death intensified, they became convenient targets in a growing fear of witchcraft. The rise in witch trials during the 15th and 16th centuries didn't happen in a vacuum. Social unrest, repeated outbreaks of plague, economic strain, and religious reform all contributed to a climate of blame. When tragedy struck as stillbirth, a mother's death, an infant's sudden illness, people looked for someone to hold accountable. Midwives, present at these critical moments, with knowledge most men didn't understand, often found themselves in the crosshairs. Their familiarity with the female body raised suspicion. They knew how to induce labor using pennyroyal rue or savin. They could end a pregnancy, though it was illegal and morally condemned. They recited charms, performed emergency baptisms, and handled blood, fluids, and death, all in a context where spiritual and physical realms were believed to overlap. Their authority threatened church structures and male-dominated medicine. What couldn't be regulated, the authorities began to prosecute. The publication of the Malleus Maleficarum in 1487 by Inquisitor Heinrich Kramer formalized and inflamed these fears. This handbook on witch hunting claimed that midwives were among the most dangerous witches. Kramer alleged they could kill infants still in the mother's womb and offer them to devils. The Malleus framed female healers as inherently suspicious, combining misogyny with religious paranoia, though not officially endorsed by the Church. The text was widely read by secular judges and clerics across the Holy Roman Empire. Real cases followed in 1587 in the Bavarian town of Dillingen. A midwife named Walpurga Hausmanin was accused of killing over 40 children through sorcery. Under torture, she confessed to calling upon demons during labor, smearing newborns with harmful oils, and flying to witches' gatherings. Her confession was extracted, detailed, and ultimately used to justify her execution by burning. Such cases weren't isolated. In Geneva, records from the early 17th century show midwives arrested and tried for supposedly reciting incantations over laboring women. In parts of France and Germany, local laws were introduced to regulate or ban certain birthing rituals entirely. Even in Protestant regions, where theological emphasis shifted away from sacramental fears, suspicion of women healers persisted. Knowledge passed from mother to daughter was now treated as evidence of secret pacts and forbidden rites. By the early modern period, male physicians increasingly replaced midwives, especially in elite households. Universities began formalizing medical education, and surgery, once seen as crude, gained respectability. Midwives, excluded from these institutions, were further marginalized. Their practical experience couldn't compete with license theory, even when their outcomes often matched or exceeded their male counterparts. Not every midwife was accused. Many continued to work quietly, trusted by their neighbors and shielded by community loyalty. But the fear lingered. In the minds of many officials and theologians, the woman who guided birth might also open the door to the devil. In medieval society, midwives stood in a space that defied easy definition. They held authority, but not office. They shaped lives, but rarely entered the historical record. In the birthing room, they were indispensable, directing the process, commanding attention, making decisions with real consequences. Yet outside that room, they existed on the margins, often excluded from the very institutions that tried to regulate their work. Unlike male physicians, who trained in universities and wrote in Latin, midwives learned through apprenticeship and oral tradition. Their expertise wasn't written in books, but carried in memory, passed from hand to hand over generations. This kind of knowledge, rooted in bodies, blood, and instinct, was invisible to the church, the state, and the academic world. It wasn't recognized as medicine, and yet, without it, childbirth remained a deadly gamble. Their authority came from experience and community trust. A midwife might be poor, unmarried, or widowed, yet when called to a birth, she outranked every other woman in the room. In those hours, she directed not only physical action, but religious urgency. If a child struggled to breathe, she could baptize it. If a mother hemorrhaged, she determined when to call a priest or a gravedigger. No cleric, no noble, no physician could match her role in that moment. But this power was limited to specific spaces and often came with isolation. Midwives worked at the edge of public life. They were not invited into courtrooms or councils. They were not protected by guilds or universities. When things went wrong, they were easy to blame. A healthy birth brought gratitude. A death brought suspicion. They also moved through taboo territory. Childbirth was connected to blood, bodily fluids, and sexuality, all viewed with religious caution. The birthing chamber, closed to men, became a place of female solidarity, but also of secrecy. What happened inside was rarely documented, unless it ended in scandal. Some midwives gained reputations that crossed parish lines. A few, like Louise Bourgeois in 17th century France, rose to serve royal families and publish treatises. But for most, their names never appeared in official records, unless tied to accusation, dispute, or death. They existed in contradiction, essential but unofficial, trusted but unprotected. They worked in the most private and most perilous moments of life, yet remained largely invisible to the world that governed everything outside the birthing room. Their influence was undeniable, but always at risk. By the 17th century, the birthing room was changing. The rise of male physicians and the professionalization of medicine began to push midwives out of the spaces they had long controlled. In elite households, especially in cities like Paris and London, doctors trained in anatomy and Latin texts were now being called to attend births, not because they knew more, but because they carried institutional authority. The shift wasn't immediate, but it was steady. As university-trained physicians entered the field of obstetrics, midwives were reclassified. Their knowledge, once trusted and vital, was now labeled as outdated, unscientific, or dangerous. Manuals written by men such as William Smelly's treatise on the theory and practice of midwifery, 1752, shaped the next era of birth care. These texts rarely acknowledged midwives' contributions, despite drawing on techniques that had been practiced by them for centuries. Tools once associated with midwives, birthing stools, herbal remedies, and swaddling methods were replaced or discarded. The birthing position itself changed. Lying flat on the back, a method preferred by male physicians for easier visibility and access, became standard. It was less effective for the laboring woman, but more convenient for the attending doctor. With the medicalization of childbirth came the erasure of female knowledge. Oral traditions were lost. Midwives, many of whom were illiterate, left behind no records. Their lives were largely undocumented unless they were accused, prosecuted, or exceptional. The history of medicine preserved the names of men who dissected cadavers and published treatises. The women who delivered thousands of children in darkened rooms were largely forgotten. Yet the knowledge didn't vanish entirely. In rural areas, midwives continued to practice well into the 19th and even 20th centuries. Their methods persisted, especially among working-class communities and in colonized regions where formal healthcare systems arrived late or not at all. In the 20th century, as feminist scholars began re-evaluating historical narratives, midwifery's role was re-examined. Historians like Barbara Ehrenreich and Deirdre English highlighted how women's medical knowledge had been systematically excluded during the rise of professional medicine. Modern midwifery, now licensed and integrated into many national healthcare systems, owes much to that forgotten legacy. Contemporary practices, from home births to the reintroduction of upright labor positions, often reflect methods used by medieval midwives, now supported by scientific research rather than dismissed as superstition. What was once erased is slowly being recovered, not only as a medical tradition, but as a record of women's work, resilience, and survival across centuries. The medieval midwife stood at the intersection of survival and silence. Her hands caught life in its first moments, yet her name rarely entered the record. She moved through blood, ritual, and fear, commanding authority in rooms otherwise controlled by men. In a world where women were often denied education, property, or voice, the midwife held knowledge that mattered. Knowledge that couldn't be easily dismissed, even by kings, bishops, or physicians. Her presence tells us something crucial about medieval power, that it wasn't always held by those with titles. In homes across Europe, midwives carried the weight of birth and death with no formal protection and little recognition. They were trusted, then suspected, needed, then regulated. And as male physicians rose and institutional medicine took hold, they were slowly pushed to the edges, their tools dismissed, their rituals banned, their contributions forgotten. Yet the profession endured, in hidden villages, behind stone walls, and through whispered instruction, women continued to learn from each other. The same techniques labeled as primitive or superstitious would later be rediscovered, studied, and in some cases validated by science centuries later. Upright birthing positions, skin-to-skin contact, natural pain relief. These are not modern inventions. They are remnants of practices once passed from midwife to apprentice, without fanfare, without credit. The story of the medieval midwife is not just about medicine. It is about gender, labor, and the ways history chooses its heroes. While universities recorded the names of men who theorized childbirth from a distance, the women who lived it remained unnamed. But their work shaped every generation that followed. Their erasure was never total. Their legacy was written not in ink, but in the survival of mothers and children across centuries and across continents.